and promoted. It always sounds so official, like, oh, I'm gonna promote you. You have a you have new responsibilities now. Do, do, do. All right, cool. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
It's going good. I'll just answer for everybody. I imagine they're all like answering, just we can't hear them. So we're just gonna have to trust that it is in fact going good for them.
hmm
Cool. All right. Well, here we are, talking pre-production, which I feel like is the key to a smooth production, at least in my experience, in my opinion. But before we get into all of that, we've spoken a handful of times, but I don't know if everybody else attending both presently and then in the future on the recording has had the pleasure. So may I have you introduce yourself, please?
yeah, so first off, thanks for having me on. We've done another one of these before, so I'm excited to be back for another one. I also want to thank everyone for joining on Father's Day. I also didn't realize that it was Father's Day when we set this up because we did set it up a couple months ago.
Hmm.
And I guess we're not really thinking that far out. But anyway, my name is Brandon Tambori. I'm a filmmaker and producer. My most recent film, which I wrote, directed, and produced, is called Plan B. It was released this past September by Quiver Distribution. It's available now on Amazon Prime and some other platforms. I also used to do a lot of work with National Lampoon, where I was doing different comedy projects, directing and producing different shows from podcasts to live comedy shows and sketch series, comedy specials, things like that. And I've also worked on some other larger movies as well. I was an associate producer on the horror film A24's horror film Hereditary. Um,
Hmm.
so I am mainly a comedy person now, but I have also worked on some horror and some other projects. So it's good to have an experience working on the lower budget indies as well as some bigger movies as well. And we'll get into all that today.
All right, cool. I love it. So on to the pre-production uh, discussion. So, like I think everybody knows pre-production is obviously the stuff that you do before production begins. But in general, because every film is different. If you're doing like a big Marvel superhero, obviously there's going to be a lot of special effects to take into account versus a contained horror movie that takes place in one house. A little different. But broadly speaking, what are some of the buckets that we kind of need to have in order for uh, like get in order in the pre-production phase? Like what are the categories that we need to contend with?
So I'd say most importantly, you're always going to want a script because you can't really film a movie without that. A budget and a schedule. We're going to get more into both of those in a bit, but those are both super important. Obviously, your crew and your cast, because you can't make a movie by yourself. And then some of the other things that we can touch on a little bit too, locations, props, travel, just in terms of the logistics of booking flights, rental cars, things of that nature, insurance. And then also something that a lot of filmmakers don't think about is just like the actual business of all of it, like starting an LLC or a corporation to run the production, a bank account, and things like that. But I think those are probably the most important things that you want to have set up in order to make sure your pre-production process and ultimately production runs smoothly.
All right, cool. And then so obviously like the situation wouldn't be ideal. Um, but have you ever been in a situation where maybe we go ahead and start shooting before we have the schedule fully figured out? Like maybe, we have like the first 2 weeks planned, but then, the last couple of days are a mystery.
So I would say that I personally haven't, but I have heard of projects that do things like that. Also, I work in comedy, so there's definitely some comedy filmmakers that might just have more of like a loose script or something like that, and they could even have just like an outline for what they want to do and then just work with a lot of improv. I haven't personally done that to that nature, but at the same time, it is effective for some people, but you're going to run into some issues, I'd say, just in terms of potentially running out of money and just not really knowing exactly what you're going to do. But schedule, I think, is actually the most important thing, and you should probably do that first, not only before you actually start shooting, but even before you start trying to put the movie together, because you need to tell your actors and crew members like how long they're going to be working And also, when you're actually raising money or trying to partner with a studio or production company, whoever's going to finance the film, they need to know how much money they're going to put into it. And say if you're like, yeah, we might shoot for 12 days or we might shoot for 20 days, that could be a difference of, at the very least, tens of thousands of dollars, but probably hundreds of thousands. And if it's a big movie, like you mentioned, Marvel, like that's probably tens of millions of dollars for an extra 8 days.
Yeah. All right, cool. So thinking about like the schedule and the budget, I guess so I'm gonna go slightly off script. I hope that's okay. First off, who in general is responsible for making the schedule and budget? So if writers are listening and they're like, I've never made a schedule before, is that something they need to worry about, or is that not that's not their responsibility?
So for a writer, I'd say it's not their responsibility, but nowadays, so many writers are just taking that initiative and actually trying to produce a little bit and really make things happen with their script rather than just sitting around and waiting for some magic producer to come in. So if you have the time, I would definitely recommend trying to budget out a movie if you can, and also a schedule. So I'll start off with if you don't really have any interest in doing it yourself or the resources, you can pretty easily hire somebody to do it. So for a schedule, you're most likely going to be looking at a first AD or first assistant director. And most of them do work for hire. So you can pretty easily just go online and find a first AD. I don't want to say pretty easily, but say if you're like for me, I work in a lot of like million to sub $3 million comedy range. So if I were to go on IMDb and look up some sub $3 million comedy movies, look at the credits and find some people who have worked as a first AD on those projects, I could pretty easily get in touch with them, whether they have their email readily available online, or maybe I could reach out on LinkedIn and just tell them about myself, send them the script. And again, a lot of them are just like work for hires. So if they're available and you're willing to offer them money, you can probably get someone to do that. You are going to have to pay them for a full schedule and budget. It could be anywhere from like 2,500 to $5,000. So it's not necessarily cheap, but I would say it's good to invest in those things because that's going to help you have a really smooth production. And I know that's just this schedule, but the budget is usually going to be a line producer or even a unit production manager. That's usually who you're looking at in the credits. And again, you can just hire somebody to do that if you'd like. And the earlier you can do that, the better. Just because, again, when you're trying to raise money, most people who were say the financiers or executive producers, production companies, whoever's going to finance the movie, they need to know how much money they're putting into it. So if you just say, "Hey, make my script," they're going to probably say no. But if you say, "Hey, can you make my script? We ran a budget. This is our line producer. Our budget's $1 million or 2 million, whatever it is." Like they need an idea of what they're really going to be able to do and what kind of resources they're going to need to put behind it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And then quick, I guess just follow-up question, just as it pertains to the script. Again, we're going slightly
Oh
off
yeah,
topic here,
whatever.
but while we're here. Because I have had the pleasure of watching a line producer break a script down before and like start counting all of the money. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is an insane process to watch. If you're not like normally entrenched into it, you're like, oh, that's how you do that. But when it comes to wanting to kind of put a budget together, like let's say we have folks who are like first time filmmakers. They don't have a resume as long as my arm. So presumably, if they want to make their own movie, it would be in their best interest to try to keep the budget as reasonable as possible. Are there are there some things that they should maybe be a little cautious of adding into the script just willy-nilly, just because it sounds cool, that
Yeah,
could spike a
I'd say
budget?
I'd say absolutely. So myself as a writer, that's one thing I always do. Like there's certain things that you really like can't compromise, but as long as you're not compromising the story, I think there's nothing wrong with keeping the budget in mind when you're writing, because a lot of line producers and even regular producers, when they're reading a script, they're thinking about money, how much can I make this for? So I'll use one example from my film Plan B, which is a I'd say that it revolves around the pregnancy of the main character. So we had a film that takes place, or I say a couple scenes that take place in a hospital. So like for me, making a pregnancy movie really needed to have some of it take place in a hospital because like we needed to see an ultrasound, we needed to see a birth. So those are things that in my mind were like pretty important to the story, and we couldn't really do without them. However, there was one scene where the main character and her best friend are at a hospital and they go to like the hospital cafeteria and have lunch, and it's like a pretty big crowded cafeteria filled with people and very lively. And as we're scouting the locations and getting closer to physical production, I was just realizing how difficult it was going to be to pull off a scene that looked good because we needed maybe like 100 extras to fill out some of these spaces we were looking at. We needed to
Yeah.
actually make it look like it was a real cafeteria in a hospital. And while that was doable, the scene really wasn't that important in terms of like the actual look of it. It was more about just our main character being able to have a few minutes to talk to her best friend before going into this ultrasound. So I was thinking like, okay, how can I do this for way less money? So I pretty much took the exact conversation and changed it from the hospital cafeteria to a hospital hallway. So they're really just walking through the hallway. We had maybe like two or three extras playing doctors and nurses and patients like walk in the background. And the scene is pretty much exactly the same as it would have been. It might not look as high end and big budget, but at the same time, I don't think anyone's really watching that scene thinking like, this scene looks doesn't look good. It just takes place in a hallway and it really fit right into the story. So that's one thing that I did, and I would totally recommend that for a lot of writers and specifically first time writers and filmmakers, just because it's really important to keep your budget as low as you can, mainly for your first movie, especially. And also, besides just saving people money and limiting risks, there's so much that can go wrong just from like an actual filmmaking perspective when you're on set and you really want to be focused on the actual story and the characters and actor performances that like you don't really want to be worrying about like 100 random extras in a big hospital cafeteria.
Yeah, that's a because one of my very first acting jobs ever was I was an extra on some movie. I was like child visiting parent in jail. Um, yeah, I don't know, just in the background. And we didn't have very many extras in that scene at all. And I was like a little professional because I had been on stage for years. So I knew how to show up on time and like be quiet and do what I was told. But I remember just because that was one of my first experiences on set ever. I think I was like maybe 13 years old. And I remember just being baffled at how long it took to get all of the extras where everybody wanted them to be and to figure out like how we wanted this to look. And it was like an entire day to do those 2 pages of conversation between the two actual principals. And a lot of it was just wrangling extras. A good chunk of the day was just wrangling extras.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. A couple other quick points that I'll bring up just about keeping the budget down. Like for a lot of the comedy that I do, a lot of it is like conversational and situational. So I'm not someone who's really like has a ton of experience working with like car chases and big action sequences, things like that. Those things are expensive.
Yeah.
So know that if you're writing an action movie or even like an action comedy, something that involves car chases, fight scenes, weapons, all of that stuff takes time. So those are things to definitely keep in mind. Again, if you're doing an action movie, you need some action sequences. So I'm not saying to get rid of it, but just know that when you're budgeting and scheduling, those things not only cost money, but they take time to do. A couple things that I did for my film Plan B that I didn't necessarily, I'd say, account for as much time as I should have. So we had a cat in the movie,
Oh yeah.
and so working with animals is definitely something that I don't want to say I wouldn't recommend, but for me, it was actually on Plan B. There was a cat that was in the script, and the cat was a pretty important part of the story to a sense, and we only had the cat for it was definitely one day, but maybe 2 days, and it was actually our first day of production.
Oh
And
no.
the first scene that I ever directed of a feature film was with this cat. And it was just, it was very hectic to start the day with this cat that wasn't necessarily doing what I needed it to do. And I was just thinking, and I said, we had a professional animal trainer on set who had this cat, and he'd work with tons of animals in movies and he's been doing it for like 40 years. So I felt really good about working with him. And then I was like, yeah, I just want the cat to be a regular cat, sit on the couch, walk around the room. And he was like, well, like there's nothing about what you're doing that makes this cat feel like a regular cat. You have a camera pointed in its face, there's like 40 people standing around it.
Bunch of lights.
It's like, yeah, I guess I didn't really think of that. And there were certain instances where the cat would just get like spooked and just run under the couch or something. And then it would take like 10 or 15 minutes to get the cat out. And those were things that I just wasn't really accounting for. Like you always hear it's not great working with animals. The movie Hereditary that I worked on, we had a dog in that movie. And I remember the dog wasn't, we had some issues with the dog as well, where if you watch Hereditary, a lot of people don't even really remember there being a dog, where in the script, the dog was definitely much more prominent and more featured. Where now in the final movie, he's maybe in like 3 or 4 scenes, and it's like they walk into the house and pet the dog. It's nothing too notable. And for the cat in my film Plan B, the cat's in the film more, but I think there was at least one, maybe 2 scenes that I wanted the cat to be in, and we were just so behind on those days of filming where I just said to the trainer, like, we're gonna scrap the cat from these scenes because we can't deal with these delays. So yeah, cats, children,
Hmm.
babies specifically. I mentioned we had a birth scene in my film Plan B, so there was an actual baby on set that was, again, actually great to work with in the grand scheme of, I guess, how difficult it could have been. But those are all things that are expensive and take a lot of time. And in film, time is money. So if you're filming something in one day and it ends up being 2 days, that extra day it will cost a lot of money.
Yeah. And whenever, because like there's always, because one of the things about talking about pre-production is that there's, you plan as best you can and you try to anticipate all contingencies. Um, but inevitably, what's going to happen is like something's going to get delayed or something's going to go mildly awry. And then at lunch, it's like director, DP, first AD, and like whoever is the producer on set are all like in a corner, like huddled, like trying to solve the problem when everybody else is eating. And it's like, oh, I wanted to ask about that scene. And somebody goes, don't talk to them right now. Like, you need to not bother them right now. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm just going to go sit at my table in the corner of Crafty here. All right, cool. So, we want to try to keep costs low, be, you know, like as best you can anticipate adventures. Which if somebody is like a first time filmmaker, it's probably a good idea to try to work with, either a first AD or a line producer who's kind of done this a couple times. Because sometimes you don't know what to anticipate, but they might. They'll be like, "Oh, I've done this scene before. This is gonna be a thing." All right, cool. So speaking of bringing people on board, so we talked about a first AD, we talked about a line producer. What are the other kind of, I guess, like really key crew members that we need early on in the pre-production process? Because obviously, by the time we're starting, we're going to have everybody, but in the early phases, in the planning, the scheduling, who is really important to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's certainly a few really, well, there's more than a few. There's a lot of really important people that work on a film. I'd say number one is a producer because the producer is actually in charge of everything. If you're viewing it as like a business, the producer is the CEO. They're in charge. When you watch the Oscars, the producer is the one who goes up and takes the award for Best Picture. So the producer is essentially the one in charge who's putting the entire team together. There's a bunch of different producers, but there's always on every movie one producer who is the top decision maker. So that person's going to be, I'd say, most important to get on first. Then you're going to need a director. Sometimes the writer is the director. I imagine a lot of people watching this now are writers, so maybe some of them are writer directors. But if you're not also directing, then you definitely need a director. After that, we talked about the line producer. That's super important because you want the line producer to help make an accurate budget for you. And AD is also important for an accurate schedule. So once we get past that, a couple of the other, I'd say, key crew positions that you're going to want as early as possible, director of photography or cinematographer. They're going to really help you design the entire look of the film. And I think it's good to bring one on as early as possible. For my film Plan B, I worked with the cinematographer Mike McGilnick. I worked with him on a short film and a comedy special and some other projects I directed. So I remember as early as me trying to first get the movie made and find financing, I told him like, "Hey, you want to shoot this once I have money?" He's like, "Absolutely." There's other times where I'd say you don't bring one on as early, and maybe you just don't have a consistent look for your movie. You don't necessarily need to bring one on like a year in advance, but at the very beginning of pre-production, you definitely need one because you need some time to just go over the different shot lists and how you want the movie to look. And then once you have the DP, as long as it's someone who's trusted, a lot of times they'll bring in the people that work under them. Think of like a first AC, which is the first assistant camera, or even like people like grip, gaffer, different people that just work in the camera and electrical department can all be just hires from the cinematographer, and they'll bring on their own people. A production designer is also a super important position. So that's someone that you'd want to bring on as early as possible because they're going to help with the, I'd say, like the inside look of the film, like how the cinematographer is going to be just like the actual camera and what the overall film looks like. The designer, production designer, is helping you with all of the sets. And a lot of times the set can just determine the overall feel of the feel of the movie and like the aesthetic look. And then I'd say one other really important position is a costume designer and just helping decide what all of the characters are going to wear. And specifically for the costume designer and production designer, besides them helping like determine how the movie is going to look, they also just need time to be able to do that. Like a costume designer is going to need to get potentially dozens, hundreds of outfits for these characters. So they're going to need some time to go out shopping, renting wardrobe, things like that. And also a production designer, just because they're going to need to go out and have time to read the script and actually see what type of sets they're going to have to build.
Mhm.
I'd say those are ones I'd say are most important, but at the same time, there's hundreds of positions on a movie, and all of them are important. The earlier you can bring people on, the better. But in a lot of instances, especially for independent films, you just don't really have the money or resources to bring all these people on that early.
Yeah. So maybe a good rule of thumb is to kind of prioritize like, okay, who is going to need the most time to do their prep, whatever the prep for their department is.
Absolutely, because there's some people, say like a production assistant, for example. They're typically like the bottom of the totem pole on set, super important position, and they're really running around doing so many things, whether they're running errands, whether they're getting coffee for someone, or whether they're actually doing something a little bit more important to the production, like helping with cast and things like that. But to be honest, there's so many production assistants, and you can typically find a production assistant like a day or two before, like, hey, we have an opening for a PA. Are you available to work? And they can pretty easily find someone. Where a production designer, you can't really call someone like 2 days before shooting, like, hey, we need you to come on board and help with all of our production design. They're going to be like, yeah, I can't do that in 2 days. The movie's not going to look good.
Yeah. Like, what are you talking about? I don't have time to reupholster this couch.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. So whoever is working the most days and you think needs the most time to prep, those are the positions I would say you should bring on as early as possible. Even like an editor, that's someone who is only working in
yeah.
post-production, but an editor is important too, because what I've learned throughout my process of filmmaking is that a lot of not a lot, but the best editors aren't really just technical editors that are just like pressing buttons. They're really helping you craft the story in post-production. There's so many things in your script that aren't really going to work once you actually see them on camera. And the editor is someone who's really supposed to be familiar with the script and going through like, okay, this isn't really going to work. This you filmed and it's not really working. We actually caught something that's really nice where like this wasn't really in the script, but you captured a really nice moment. I think we have to somehow fit that in. So like an editor can be really creative too. And it's also great if you bring them on before you start shooting, they can actually give you some notes on the script. Like, hey, from my experience, this is going to be a disaster to edit and it doesn't really seem super important. So maybe there's a way we can rework the script a little bit to make it so this makes more sense in the edit.
Yeah. Like maybe we don't shoot this one scene in this giant cavernous echoey room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, it's things like that that had never occurred to me until I was working on set. Then I see like a big like echoey like art museum, and I'm like,
Yeah, well, I think that's a good, another really important position, and we could talk more about this for sure, is a location manager.
Yeah.
So locations are obviously super important. There's some things that maybe you could find last minute, but I mentioned for Plan B, we filmed in a hospital, or like the movie Hereditary I worked on, almost all of that movie was actually just built on a soundstage. So something like that, it takes time to be able to build sets on sound stages. And you ideally want to go on location scouts, see what you can actually find for like practical physical locations. Then whatever you can't find, you might have to build. So the earlier you can do your location scouting, the better.
All right, cool. Because that was actually going to be my next question. And then I guess follow up to that, who like who goes on the locations? Because obviously there's a location manager. And then, the decision makers is like, oh yeah, we're shooting here versus not there. Who is involved in those decision making processes? Like, is it just the director and producer? Does, the DP and then, whichever sound person
Yeah,
is
so I'd
just
say it
there?
really it depends on the scale of the movie. Like for my film Plan B, I actually did all of it myself, which I would never recommend for
Bless your
anybody.
heart.
Really not good. I'll definitely share some positives and negatives of that. But for more of a traditional movie like Hereditary, for example, which is something in that like $5 to $10 million range, where that's considered a lower budget independent film in like the grand scheme of things. Something like that, I believe it was. I didn't go on the location scouts, but I believe it was maybe like two of the producers, the director, the usually either the line usually the line producer, because a lot of times the line producer is hired specifically because they have worked in that area before. So
Hmm.
for Hereditary, that was filmed in Utah, and we had a line producer from Utah working and hiring a lot of crew that they've worked with in that area before. So the line producer a lot of times will be on these location scouts, and then usually some kind of local location manager who came in. And if you're lucky enough, the cinematographer too, if they're brought on early enough, because they can help with things like, hey, we're not going to be able to really shoot in here, or like this is going to look great. Let's try to shoot here.
Yeah, like, oh no, that window is going to be a pain in the ass come 3 p.m.
Yeah, yeah, you don't want like a gigantic team on these location scouts, but if you can have more of that key crew, I'll say also for Plan B, there was a couple locations that I think like maybe we were down to like two options and I wasn't really sure what to pull the trigger on. And the production designer was in town at that point and was able to come with me because it was like a couple of days before the shoot. So I found all the locations myself, but I do remember the production designer came with me for I think one day while I was looking at some like very last minute tweaks.
Hmm.
But there's so many things that go into this. Like you mentioned, the echoey room.
Yeah.
So there's so many things besides the actual look of a location that you need to think about that myself as a creative, I wasn't necessarily thinking about while I was doing these location scouts 100% by myself. So for Plan B, we filmed it in South Jersey, which is where I'm from. I currently live in South Jersey. I had a lot of connections and resources there. And at this point in the process, the movie was greenlit. We had at least our lead actress on board and we had our dates locked. And I knew the movie was happening. And I think we were like probably 2 months from shooting and trying to save money and also just thinking that I was able to do it on my own. I just decided, like, all right, I'm going to find all of these locations myself. So I was doing all of it alone. And I'm really just looking at places based on the aesthetic appeal. Like, okay, this is going to look great on camera. I was taking pictures, sending it to the cinematographer, and we were really loving some of the locations. And I ended up just booking a lot of them. Some of them we had to pay deposits and rental fees up front and things like that. A lot of the locations ended up working out great, but there definitely were a handful that we ended up not being able to film at, and we actually lost some money on. And hypothetically, if I would have just hired a location manager or a traditional location scout or someone like that, they probably would have been able to go with me and tell me some of the mistakes that I was making in advance. And all of the money I lost on these unused locations could have went to paying that person. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. A couple specific examples. There was a Jamaican cafe that I wanted to film at. I had written in the script, I was like, we're going to film at an authentic Jamaican cafe. And there's this place that I scouted and loved. I was like, this is awesome. The owner was super nice and on board for us to film there. And then As we're actually in production and maybe a day or two away from filming at this place, someone from the crew pulls me aside. I forget who it was, maybe the UPM or AD or production design or somebody, and they're like, "Hey, so we went to this Jamaican cafe that you found, and there's no parking spots. Like where our whole crew and cast and everyone's supposed to park. It's like on a busy street, and we need like 40 parking spots." And I'm like, well, we can't figure that out. They're like, no, like this is going to be a disaster. We're going the middle of the day, and there's other local businesses around. Like we should not film there. And we ended up not being able to film there. We had to scramble and find another place last minute, like a day or two before we shot. And I think we might have actually paid that Jamaican cafe as well. Another example was there's a baby shower scene, and I just was going out and actually looking at like venues where you would actually traditionally have a baby shower. So it was like I was going out and just finding venues because in South Jersey, it's not necessarily like there's tons of places that have Hollywood movies filming there. Like I'm just going into local businesses and introducing myself and saying I'm a filmmaker and wanted to potentially use their location for a movie. And for this spot where I wanted to have the baby shower scene, it was really just like a pretty much a venue where you could go to have a real baby shower or even a wedding or some kind of big party or something like that. And I just actually booked it. I booked the venue for a day and ended up paying. And I remember the production designer and some of the crew that needed to go set that up needed to get into that location a day early. And when they went to do that, the location's like, no, you booked it tomorrow. You can't get in today. And there
Mm.
wasn't even an event or anything going on, and they just wouldn't let us in the night before to set up. And just imagine setting up an entire scene for like a baby shower. It's like setting up a real baby shower. It was going to take, I think the production designer's like, I need at least 6 hours to get this looking film ready. And if we got in that morning and spent 6 hours, that would have been half of our day. We wouldn't have been able to really get any of our scenes done. So we again had to scramble and find a new spot. And I remember, I think we spent $1,000 renting that first location, and it didn't work out. So like that's money you don't get back, and definitely a mistake I wouldn't make again on my next feature. So you've really got to be careful about that kind of stuff. There's also like I was luckily thinking about this element, but what potential sound? Like you mentioned that echo. One place I remember I really liked, but like the floor was a little bit creaky. Like you'd step on it
Oh,
and
yeah.
make a little sound. And I remember calling the sound mixer and saying like, "Hey, is this going to be an issue?" And it's pretty much just like I always say, it's like with food, they're like, when in doubt, throw it out if it's still good. Like
Mhm.
if you think there's potentially going to be an issue, there's going to be an issue.
There's
So
gonna be a problem.
just
Yeah.
just go find another place if you think the sound's going to be an issue. And also like if you're say if it's on a building that's on like a busy street or something. Like if you have a sound stage and you're building a location, you don't really have to worry about a lot of these things. But filming in actual areas, super important. Like we filmed in so many, the whole movie was shot on location for Plan B. So for that, we really had to be careful with a lot of these. Another thing to think about is how far away your locations are from each other. I remember we had one day where we were doing a company move going from one location to another. And I didn't really think about this, but it was like a 40-minute drive.
Mm.
And I'm thinking like, who cares? It's 40 minutes. But then as we were in production and some of the crew was like, yeah, it's a 40-minute drive, but what about like the hour it's going to take us to load and unload all of the gear and then another hour to set up? That's going to be like our whole day. We really should not do this move. And we had to scrap that location. So there were a handful, maybe like four locations that I scouted and we agreed to shoot at that we ended up not filming at. So again, location scout, super important to bring on early. Um, and I would say for all the filmmakers out there that think you can do it yourself, maybe you can, but try to keep those things I just mentioned in mind. I was trying to save money, and I think I ended up probably costing the production a little bit of money and also creating some headaches.
Yeah. I mean, like headaches are always gonna come. Like when you're making a project, like it just is what it is, like Murphy's Law. I don't necessarily think this is a problem anymore, so or a huge problem anymore, so I've been told by my sound mixer friends, but like the legendary cricket on set that no one can find.
Yeah, I thankfully didn't have that. But another thing that everyone should always think about is lawnmowers outside.
Oh
So
yeah.
that's something I remember. I think this was actually our first day of shooting Plan B, where we were working with the cat, and there's already so many things going on. And then we just the cat's finally good and settled, and then we just hear a lawnmower going outside.
Seriously.
Like, oh my gosh. And then at that point, you're actually telling the PAs to like go out and pay give the lawnmower guys like 20 or 30 bucks just to like, hey, can
Quiet.
you be quiet for an hour while we do this? And you're just like handing these people cash. We definitely did that on Plan B.
We,
Um, I
oh,
would say in terms of all those like last minute location switches I mentioned too, like thankfully for Plan B, we didn't really have any difficulty. Like the locations we needed to find last minute were all doable, but there's some locations that you might not be able to find. It's like similar, like I mentioned, bringing on a production designer or someone like that last minute. It's just not feasible. For Plan B, we filmed scenes in a hospital. So like that's something that you
there's
probably
that.
can't find. You're not going to be able to find a hospital last minute. Like for us, we actually had to film in a medical school, and it ended up being a lot easier because it looks like a hospital and had all of the stuff we needed, but it wasn't a functioning hospital.
Hmm.
We also like filmed in a nightclub. That's something that probably would have been harder to pull off last minute. Um, we definitely had a decent amount of bigger sets, I'd say, for a smaller movie, but there's certain things, maybe like a restaurant or a bar or an apartment. You can probably find those things a day or two before filming if you really need to, but it's not a good idea just because you need time to prep.
Yeah. Best practices. Try to get it all squared away before it's time to go. And
Yeah.
maybe,
Um, Another thing too to mention is I've never done this, but there's certain filmmakers that will actually make an entire movie based on the fact that they have access to a really good location.
hmm.
Say maybe you have a friend who works in a school or is a teacher, and they're like, "Hey, yeah, closed for the summer. If you want to film a movie here, go for it." Then you go and write a script that takes place in a school, or you have a friend who's got like a big mansion on the beach, and no one's going to be there for a couple weeks, and they're like, "Hey, yeah, come film here for a couple weeks," and then you decide to write a movie that takes place in a mansion on the beach. You're getting tons of production value and just a great look and great location for free. So that's definitely something you can do as well. Use all of those resources you have to be able to, or try to be able to pull in nice locations.
Yeah, I would say, because some advice that I've heard given to like first time filmmakers, like, is usually your first film is probably going to be a short. It's possible, but it's not terribly common that somebody dives right into a feature for their very first project. So if you like want to get into directing, you've never done it before, maybe a short film is the way to go. And I've heard people give the advice with a short film of like, oh, just look at what you have and work backwards from there
Yeah,
to make it
that is
doable.
that is certainly some good advice. I would definitely say for all the filmmakers out there, I would always start with a short just to give yourself one, just something to have on your resume. Two, something that you can just show people when you're trying to make a feature. You could say, yeah, this is my short. This is what I directed before.
Mhm.
And it also just gives you that experience. Because when you're on a set, like I learned working on Plan B, that was the first time I directed a feature. I had directed some other projects before, but my short film was like a very low budget short that was just like a few friends that we filmed in 2 days. Um, I directed some other stuff for National Lampoon, but it was mainly like comedy specials and sketch shows, things like that. But this was like an actual Plan B was a feature that I was fully in charge of and working with some like recognizable actors. Like it starred Jamie Lee, John Heater from Napoleon Dynamite, and then we had like some legends like Tom Berenger and Shannon Elizabeth on set. So it's really just to me as someone who I'm now 30, but when I was on set for that movie, I was 27, and I'm the one in charge at 27 years old, like giving orders to not really orders, but at least being in charge and like the captain of the ship. It certainly was very intimidating for me. And I could have probably used a little bit more directing experience before I actually did that. So the more experience you can have, even if it's just a short film, I would say the better.
Yeah, I'm all about it. All right, cool. So let's just imagine in the timeline, we've got the script. Script is good. It's locked. Schedule and budget is together. We've got kind of our team players who need all of the time to prep are in place and doing whatever prep they need. We've got the locations. Let's pretend that all the locations are good and we're not going to have a cricket or a lawnmower or a squeaky floor or a echoey room, or no parking or whatever the thing may be. So at what stage do we start thinking about casting. Because I was never an actor that people would like approach with an offer. Like I auditioned and then was lucky enough to get a job. So I joked that I was always the last person on board. But that's not always the case. So what is the casting process like?
So the casting process is like everything else, it's going to be different for every movie. I'll give a couple different examples, but in a lot of instances, it's going to be very difficult to get the financing for your movie without having any cast on board. So, like for example, I'm putting together a feature film right now, and it's a romantic comedy, and we have both of the lead actors, like the male and female role, both of them are already cast, and we don't even have a start date. Hopefully, the movie happens some point soon, but you really never know when you're putting a movie together. Earlier you can get the cast, the better in that sense, because when you're going out to financiers, a lot of times they'll say, okay, who's starring in it, especially if it's a bigger level production. So you'll usually get at least one of your leads on board before getting financing. And then as you get closer to production, a lot of the other roles is starting with like the leads and then trickling down to like the supporting leads and ultimately supporting will all kind of trickle in. And then for the day players, like you mentioned yourself as an actress, you're getting a lot of these roles like potentially last minute. Sometimes it could be a couple weeks before the shoot. Sometimes it's during the shoot.
Yeah.
For Plan
Like
B,
we
we
need you
definitely
tomorrow.
yeah, we definitely for Plan B had some people like Jamie Lee, who's the lead in that film. She came on board maybe like 2 months or 3 months before we started. It might have been a little bit more, but like a couple months before we started shooting, we got her, made a start date, and then we started casting the rest of the roles right away. And John Heater ended up coming on board maybe like a month before the shoot. But one good thing about that as well is once you do, I was in a unique situation, I'd say, where I was thankfully able to get all the financing without having any of the cast, which is a little bit more difficult to do. But if you can do that, great, because then you have all of your money and it's much easier to get cast to come on board once you do have financing. Because you say, hey, we have a go movie. Here's an offer. Do you want to do it? Whereas a lot of times, like for this other feature I'm putting away or putting together right now, you say, hey, here's the script. This is like what we can offer you pending that we are able to get money. So people come on board and they hope the movie's happening. They believe in it, but there's a realistic chance that it never gets made, unfortunately. So many movies happen like that. But if you have your financing, it's much more easy because you're like, look, we're shooting this movie. We need you for 2 weeks from here to here. We'll pay for your travel and everything. It's a lot easier to say yes or no. So again, some people come on, or some actors will come on very early in the process. Sometimes they'll come on even before you even have a script. Like you'll see sometimes for like a big studio, like, oh, Netflix is greenlighting this new Kevin Hart movie, and this person is going to be writing the script. So sometimes it will be in like the conception phase where maybe they are involved at the producerial level as well, the actor that is. I would say that myself as a writer, I'm assuming a lot of the people on this session right now and listening in are writers themselves. I'll always think about casting while writing the script. So a lot of times you'll be told as a writer not to do that. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I always do it. I think if anyone says they're not doing that, they are probably lying. And again, I think it's a great thing to do. And I'll go into an example about my film Plan B. So when I was trying to raise money for Plan B, which was about a year and a half before we shot the movie, so like I wrote this script and it was pretty much sitting in a drawer for maybe like 2+ years. No one had really read it. And then I was like, I'm going to try to actually make this. So I put together a pitch deck, which, again, for everyone listening, it's like a pretty much like a PowerPoint presentation just showing what the movie is because a lot of producers and financiers don't feel like reading a script. They just want to see something of what the movie is. And this one was half creative, so it went into detail about the story, the characters, the experience of myself and the team. And then the other half was like business related, like, okay, this is how much money we need. This is what our budget is. This is where we're going to spend the money. This is what we're going to do with the movie once we finish it. So when you're putting together a pitch deck like that and you say, have like a character slide of your characters, it's always good to have just, I'd say, like dream actors shown. And for my project Plan B, I actually had John Heater's picture for that Evan character and we ended up getting
Perfect.
him, which was amazing because that way, like he's someone that I always envisioned in that role, and we were able to actually get him, which is great. So investors and production partners are putting money behind this movie, thinking like, okay, in a perfect world, we'll get John Heater or someone like John Heater. And then when you actually do get John Heater, everyone's super excited, which is great because he was like perfect for that role. And even the lead actress of the film, Jamie Lee, she was someone that I was a huge fan of for years. So for reference, we filmed Plan B in the summer of 2022, and back I'd say back in, I think it was 2019, I sent a text to one of my friends saying they had read my script was and I was like, Jamie Lee would be such a good Piper for my movie. And then 3 years later, I actually was able to get Jamie to do the movie. So at least even at that point, 3 years before shooting, I was not only thinking about casting, but thinking about Jamie Lee in that role. And I remember showing Jamie that text like once we wrapped production, and I was like, look, look at this. Like when um, they say not to think of your actor sometimes, but I had thought of Jamie Lee and John Heater in those two roles years before we actually shot. So I say the earlier the better.
That's awesome. I love it. I love it. All right, so final question from me, just in terms of like, the stuff I was like, oh, we should cover this for pre-production, and then we will go to questions from you all. So if you have any questions that are lingering and are not related to rehearsing with actors and crew, please put them into the Q&A. But my question to you is, do you ever rehearse with actors and crew prior to production start? Because obviously, it's not going to work like a play. Like we don't do a full run through with everybody. Um, but prior to either maybe prior to production or prior to like actually shooting the scene itself, like do you ever do a rehearsal or kind of do a run through?
I would
Uh,
say yes. I would definitely recommend it if you have the luxury. Like you said, like sometimes you just don't do it. And I'm sure that if every filmmaker had the option to have rehearsals, like most would like to do it. Sometimes you're like, I don't like rehearsals because there might be something really good and I would just want to be filming the whole thing. So that could be one example of why you wouldn't want to do rehearsals. But if you don't really believe in that method, I would say the more rehearsing you can do, the better, because there's certain things that just don't really work and you're not really going to know until you see them play out. So for
mhm,
Plan B, we honestly just didn't really have the resources to have like full on rehearsals before we started shooting. But even though we didn't, I made it a point to take some time and go over the script individually with all of the actors before we actually were on set. Like I remember Jamie Lee, our lead, for example, like a couple weeks before we were shooting, like her and I were really going over the script in depth. And there's like some certain things where not necessarily she had issues, but she had some notes like, hey, what if like this thing's a little bit confusing? Like, can you work on this a little bit? Or she brought some of her really good own ideas into the not only the character of Piper that she played, but also the script in general. Like the Evan character played by John Heater in the script, he had a YouTube channel that in hindsight, looking back, was like kind of confusing and a little bit unclear as to what this YouTube channel was. And Jamie said to me, that YouTube channel thing is like kind of confusing. It's like a storyline that's just not doesn't really have a full resolution. And I think it's going to confuse people. And I was like, yeah, you know what? Like, after thinking more about it, I think you're right. And I went in and I totally scrapped the YouTube channel, and it's not in the movie. And it wasn't in the script. It's better to scrap those things from the script, because had I went and shot a bunch of things for the YouTube channel, it would have costed money. And then at that point, we probably would have cut them from the movie anyway. So it's always good to be able to cut things out of the script. We were talking about that in terms of saving money before. And
mhm.
those are things you might realize in the rehearsal phase. So, the very least, go over the script with your actors if you have the chance to. And then regardless, before you're actually rolling cameras, you're always going to want to do some kind of rehearsal, even if it's just a blocking rehearsal. And for all those
Right.
listening, a blocking rehearsal is essentially just a rehearsal so you could see like how the characters and the actors are actually going to play out the scene in terms of like moving around. You might just have two people sitting in a room, but maybe you have two people and one of them is like eating a sandwich, or one of them is folding laundry, something like that. And it's really good to be able just to practice that, not only so the actors can like rehearse their emotions and lines, but just the physical actions. Because if you're reading a script, you're reading the lines, but at the same time, you're not like saying your lines while also multitasking and folding laundry or whatever it is you're doing. And besides being a rehearsal for the actors, it's also a rehearsal for the crew because the cinematographer needs to know like what you want the camera movements to be like,
Mhm.
where he's pointing the camera. Do you have multiple cameras? Are you shooting with one camera? Things like that. So when you get to your location and the cameras are set up, or even before they're set up, a lot of times you want to do a blocking rehearsal. So then the crew can set up the gear and equipment based on what the blocking is going to look like. And then you can actually start doing real rehearsals sometimes with the actors if you want. Again, some people might want to record it all. For me, I think I would always, if unless we just don't have the time to do it and we're running really late, to do a rehearsal or two, just with the actors as is, and you don't even need to film it, but just do the rehearsal, and that way it just gets everyone in the moment a little bit more and gives everyone a little more prep.
Yeah, and kind of gets the first take rust off.
Yeah, absolutely. And who knows? Some directors might not want to work with rehearsals. There might be some
Yeah,
actors that don't like it either. Like, yeah, just record it. Let's not even rehearse. Let's just go for it. But
yeah,
I'd say if you have time for it, why not?
yeah. I I personally always prefer, maybe it's my background on stage. I always prefer. I was like, I will rehearse as long as you want me to. I'm happy to do it. Please let me run this 1,000 times. But especially if you gave me props. Like if I had physical things to do, like there was something about um having props, and I not even like complicated props. Like Lord forbid I'm in an action movie where I have to like dismantle and reassemble a gun while I'm delivering lines. It'd be a nightmare. But anytime my hands have to do something while I'm talking, it's all of a sudden like I can't figure out how to speak. Um,
And that happens to a lot of people. I've seen that on set where like an actor who's a super talented actor might just freeze up. They're like, "Yeah, I didn't realize I was going to be like chopping a piece of fruit while I was saying this." And
yeah.
then they're thinking about chopping the fruit, and then they can't really focus on the actual scene. So those are things that rehearsals can get worked around. And when you just mentioned props too, I think I said props really early on, just about like one of the important things of pre-production. Like that's something else that you really need time to be able to find props. You don't necessarily always think about that, but if you have a good prop master, I remember for Plan B, we had a great prop master. So like every time I needed something, I was like, oh my gosh, where is this plant that we need? And the prop master would just pull it out. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, wow, that's awesome that you actually got that and you're prepared. It was like every time we needed something, this guy, John, who we used, was awesome and had every single thing. And he's like, why wouldn't you have it? That's my job. And I was like, yeah, that's, that's very true. But I've definitely worked with some people, not necessarily for props, but there's some people who come and they're unprepared. But if you have good crew who are prepared, and that's again, prop master needs some time to find all these props.
Mhm.
Earlier you can bring them on, the better.
Yeah. And also need some time to get them approved by, director and producers and what have you. Because, I mean, if it's just like a pen, then who really cares? But because I was doing a web series once where we had a whole thing with a wedding ring. Um, this wedding ring, oh my lord. The
Yeah,
drama of the wedding ring, trying to find the darn thing, but also because it was going to get kicked into a fountain, so nobody wanted to buy like an actual ring and like spend all that money. And so they had to find a fake ring that looked real, but there were also like several backup rings to so that whatever got kicked into the fountain, like if we couldn't immediately find it into the fountain, we could just swap one of the backups and just keep going. The drama of the wedding ring. The director didn't like the look of it, but it was too late.
I could definitely imagine that. And I've run this is a very funny story I'll share that I don't know if I've ever told anyone this, at least like publicly. So it's definitely a good one.
Bring it on.
And this ties certainly in the pre-production for sure, and specifically costumes and also props a little bit as well. But I remember for Plan B, there's a baby. I mentioned the baby shower scene. The thing is, it's a surprise baby shower.
Mm.
So Jamie Lee's character Piper does not know that she's going to a baby shower. She actually thinks she's going to break up with her boyfriend, and then she gets there, and it's a surprise baby shower. So I
Ah.
should have said spoiler alert for that before, for the people that haven't seen the movie. But anyway, I remember that morning she comes dressed. The costume designer is like, "Hey, here's Jamie," and I just was like, what is she wearing?" And I apparently she's like, "Oh, you approved that," and I had so many different things going through my mind, and I don't really. I didn't specifically remember approving that, but I guess that I did. She probably, sorry about that. She probably asked me when I was in the middle of other stuff and was just like signed off on it because this outfit she was wearing was like this beautiful dress. And I said to the costume designer and even Jamie, like, yeah, like if she's going to break up with her boyfriend, she would not be wearing that. She doesn't know that it's a surprise baby shower. She
Right.
just going to break up with her boyfriend. And we were on location at this venue with a bunch of extras, and we were already running late, and all of our characters were there because it's a baby shower. So like we had like Shannon Elizabeth and Tom Berenger and John Heater. All of our characters were there as well as probably 20 extras. And we didn't have all of our wardrobe with us because our wardrobe was all at the base camp area. So I'm kind of scrambling, like I can't have her wearing this because it's going to mess up the scene. And me and Jamie actually, because Jamie was like, "Yeah, I agree. Like, I totally agree with what you're saying. I should have handled it differently in hindsight. I shouldn't have. I don't think I should have really mentioned it in front of Jamie or some of the other people because I kind of panicked, and other people on the crew saw that I panicked, and I think it just created a little bit of a bad situation on set. But anyway, we had no other clothes for Jamie to wear, and we were running really late. I think she might have sent her assistant out to a store to see if he could buy something last minute. And we ended up actually going out to the holding area, me and Jamie, with all of the extras. And we're like, hey, does any chance anyone has
Walking
any
out.
extra outfits? Uh, and there was one woman there whose name was Lou. I still remember her. And she had a few extra outfits, and one of them looked like it was going to fit Jamie and was more in line with the scene. So we ended up just taking this extra outfit that one of the extras had, and Jamie is wearing it in the scene in the movie. And the funny thing is, we needed that same outfit for another scene in the movie that takes place like before that was filmed in a different day. So we ended up having to say to her, like, we're going to buy this dress off you because we need it now for the movie.
Here's $50. You can have this other dress. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's something that again, like it's
Oh,
not that was on me because I apparently approved this costume. So I would say for all the filmmakers out there, really think about these costumes and when you're speaking with your costume designer, like the earlier you can have that person on the better because we had so many different looks in that movie and I think our costume designer could have had more time because I remember her name was Lisa was very like scattered at times because I threw so much work on her like a week or two before we started shooting. Like we didn't have a ton of prep time, and she could have definitely used some more. But we at least got that funny story out of it. And there's this scene in the movie where Jamie is wearing a dress that was taken from a background actor.
that's hilarious. I was about to say, I'm like, you're either gonna have to swap wardrobe with somebody, or she's just gonna have to wear whatever she wore to set that day. But that could have easily been like a sweatpants and a sweater, depending on what the call time was. Um, yeah. Oh boy. Well, the things you do. Just goes to show everybody if you are a first time filmmaker, you will end up probably having to pivot a little bit. But that's okay. That's okay. There's always a solution to be found, even if it is just paying an extra to take her dress instead. Do what you gotta do. All right, cool. So we're gonna go to questions from the writers, which I think we did too good a job explaining things because there aren't a huge number of questions. So do a worse job explaining things next time, Brandon, then they'll have more questions. So Edgar is asking, are there any apps or software you recommend for production scheduling? I've worked with Gemini Crown Tech. I don't think I've ever heard of that one. And it's definitely a game changer, whether you're learning or planning a production schedule.
Okay, so great question, Edgar. Like Alexandra, I've actually not heard of Gemini Crown Tech either, but again, I'm more of a writer director, so I don't work in scheduling a ton. However, I have done scheduling, and for Plan B, I actually did do the schedule myself. So I talked about bringing on an AD early on, if possible. I didn't necessarily have the resources or the money to hire an AD that early on. So before I set out to raise any money, I just went through the entire script myself and broke it down. And the program I used is Movie Magic. So
Yeah.
what I learned, and at least I didn't necessarily just learn this from making Plan B, but Hereditary and all of the other movies I've worked on, Movie Magic is pretty much the industry standard for what all ADs use. And it's not only for scheduling, it's also for budgeting. So there's two different programs, Movie Magic Scheduling and Movie Magic Budgeting. So I'm not sure how much they cost right now. They're not free programs, but if you really want an accurate budget and schedule, I would say that it's worth investing in them because if you ask a producer to make your movie and they're like, sure, send me the script and budget, and you send them a script that's not in Movie Magic or at least doesn't look very similar to Movie Magic, they're probably not going to take the project too seriously. And even if you don't necessarily know how to use them, there are really good resources online that you can actually use for free. So, for example, I remember I got Movie Magic budgeting and Movie Magic scheduling. I had some experience looking at budgets and schedules on them, but never used the program at all before. And I also never really oversaw a budget even close to what I was trying to raise for Plan B. So I ended up getting both of the apps and I just went online and looked up different tutorials on how to use them. So Entertainment Partners is the company that makes a movie, or I'm assuming they still do, but at least at this point, which was a couple years ago, they were the ones that I think made Movie Magic Budgeting and Movie Magic Scheduling. And on their YouTube channel, and I did actually just look at this morning because I plan to mention it on this session. All the videos are still available. Entertainment Partners YouTube channel has full tutorials that are like long, in-depth videos on how to use Movie Magic Scheduling and how to use Movie Magic Budgeting. And if you have no idea how to use these videos break down every single thing and can get anyone to be able to make a budget and a schedule. You still need to at least have an idea of what things cost. Like it's not going to say like your location is going to cost $1,000, but it will show you like the technical side on navigating both of these platforms. And again, if you make a schedule early on, and you do your schedule and it's 15 days, then you know in your budget, when you're budgeting right after that, that, okay, we need to budget for 15 days. Because if you budget for 15 days or you budget for 20 days, those budgets are going to be wildly different numbers because every day of
Right.
production is expensive. Um, Another thing as well that you can do with movie magic scheduling, and I think you can with budgeting as well, is if you're also the writer like I was, and I think a lot of people listening now are writers, if you have the final draft version of your script, which final draft, like Movie Magic, is like the industry standard of screenwriting softwares. So if you're using Final Draft, you can actually upload your final draft file into Movie Magic, and it will give you it won't give you a budget and schedule, but it will at least give you it'll pretty much identify a lot of different things in your script and it will make it way easier opposed to just jumping into Movie Magic and starting with a blank slate. You can
Mhm.
upload your final draft file and it will make things way, way easier. And another thing you can do for all the writers listening is when you're working on your script, like once it's all done and you think you're getting to the point where you're actually gearing up to shoot and getting ready for pre-production, there's certain elements you can add to the final draft file to make it way easier for a line producer or an AD to break down the script for the budget and the schedule. Like, for example, a script, like it might identify that there's a character in the movie. Say you have a character named Jim and you can just tell that that's a character because Jim has dialogue and Jim is added into the script as a character and like it's in all caps. But there might be Jim looks over and sees Mysterious Man. And maybe Mysterious Man doesn't have any lines and it's just mentioned in an action line that Mysterious Man is there. So there's not really any indication if you're just uploading the script into Movie Magic that there's a character called Mysterious Man because they have no dialogue and they're not really added as a character. You can highlight that Mysterious Man, like the line that you have written, and have add as non-speaking character. So that way, when you're breaking down the script and casting the movie, you can see, okay, there's actually a few non-speaking characters as well that we need to account for. And I'd recommend doing that for anyone who's not just a standard background actor. So for all of my scripts, I would do that, and I'd add in if you're in like an arena or something and there's 100 background characters, you're not going to do that for everyone. But if there's any like distinct person and distinct character, even if they have no lines. If you're like, okay, this is like, even if it's a featured extra, I'd say featured background is what they're called sometimes. Why not add them into the script and you can really make sure you find the perfect actor for that role? Because some people call them extras, but background artist, I think, is what a term a lot of them like to go by. Like, there's certainly a lot of background actors who are professional background actors who are either doing that for a living or they're doing that while they're trying to really make it as a full-time actor.
Hmm. Yeah, because that's I've personally never been on a shoot where somebody forgot about the featured background or um uh what what have you. But I can imagine how that would happen, especially like a somebody's first go around where maybe like a first AD didn't like go through it with a fine tooth comb to make sure we got everything squared away. Where it's like, oh no, we need a stern looking woman behind the light. Like they don't speak, but there's like a whole comedy bit of like the stern librarian. We don't have a stern librarian. Then you're like, okay, who can pull off stern in the crowd
Exactly.
today?
I remember for Plan B, since I had worked on some other films before, I at least knew that going into Plan B, and I think we did a good job of finding a lot of the featured background. And sometimes you can actually hire a you might have an actual casting director doing it, or there might be either a local casting director or maybe specifically a background casting director that you can bring on. My
Mm-hmm.
film didn't really have that luxury, so I just assigned that to one of the crew members, like, hey, you're in charge of finding all these background actors, and gave them like a list of what I actually needed. But I do remember there's a nightclub scene that we have where there's a bunch of different characters in that nightclub, and several of them are just like featured background. They're heavily featured, and like the protagonist interacts with them, but they don't really have lines. And one of these characters got lost in the shuffle a little bit. And the person who was in charge of all of the background said to me on set, like, okay, here's everyone. You can kind of just pick out who you want. And there really wasn't anybody who fit this one specific character. And I remember I actually got one of the crew members and I was like, you're this person because nobody in our background fits this role. And one of our crew members filled in as a featured background character in the movie, which is pretty
Love it. You grab one of the grips. You're like, congratulations, you're at a nightclub now.
fun. Yep, absolutely.
They're like, oh, okay, yeah, so that sounds good. Let's do it. All right, cool. So possibly our final question, unless another one sneaks in. So Alan is asking, other than writing the script, what else is expected of just the writer on a feature? So not the writer director, just the writer.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think some of it I can use from my previous answer in terms of helping break down the script a little bit. Like, again, you don't necessarily need to ever do that, but it certainly helps. So, if there's a non-speaking character in the script, you can really go in and add all of those elements. And it's not only the non-speaking characters, you can also add in props and things like that. If there's a really important prop, sometimes you'll even write that prop in all caps in the script, which I've seen sometimes while reading scripts. But you can go through and add those. So it doesn't hurt as a writer to go through and do some research on movie magic and start adding some of these elements to your script. So again, you don't need to do that. Most people and most writers probably don't. But if a line producer is going to break down a script and they're like, oh, wow, the writer already added this, it's definitely a perk. Another thing I'd say the writer can do, and again, I don't think anything's really expected of the writer, but there's certainly things you can do to like help make yourself stand out and make other people's jobs easier. But you can go through and try to make the budget as short as you can based on some of the tips that we've talked about earlier on in this. Like, if after watching this, you're like, hey, you know what? Like, I do have a scene that takes place in this really busy location just for no reason. Maybe you do go back and go ahead and change that. Another thing too is the number of characters. I always tell writers to focus on this because it's ultimately going to help get your film made, if you can keep the budget as low as possible. And I'm not saying to do that by compromising your story, but make it as expensive as it needs to be. There's no reason to have a big action sequence just to have it. Like if it's necessary for the story, absolutely put it in there. But if it's not necessary, don't really include it. So you can go through every scene, and maybe you have a scene that takes place at a pizza place, and then another scene that takes place in a diner. And those are two different locations that the crew will have to go out and rent. And it's probably not super important to the story in most instances that you have those two different locations. So you're like, yeah, what if both of them took place in the pizza shop or both of them took place in the diner? That way you're saving a lot of money and a lot of time on set to the crew. And even if you're just the writer and you're not a director, not a producer, and you're not really the one dealing with that, it's ultimately going to make your script more producible because you're getting you're making it just more efficient to be able to shoot. There's so many times where a producer reads a script and they're like, yeah, this is going to be way too expensive. But if you're like, yeah, there's really not that many locations. Same thing with characters as well. I'll read so many scripts that have like 50 characters, and there might just be like 10 of them that have like one or two lines, and it might not really be needed. Sometimes it's nice. Not sometimes. In a perfect world, you could have as many characters as you want, but you can probably get rid of a lot of those characters and give their dialogue to another character to have fewer, juicier roles, which one helps casting, and it also saves a lot of money by not having to hire that many different actors for the movie. I'm trying to think. There's one other thing I wanted to say as well, um, which is just the overall, like the length of your script, like a
Mm,
page, regardless of what it is, it takes time to shoot pages of a script. So a lot of scripts, especially by first time writers, or not even first time writers, but unproduced writers, I'll get a script and it's like 120 pages. Like producers, even if your script is really good, like just the thought of have a producer opening up a PDF and the script's like 120 or more pages, a producer, honestly, for the most part, I think they're going to dread reading it. Where if they get a script and it's 90 pages or 95 or really anything less than 100, they're going to be like, okay, this is going to take me way less to read, way less time to read than it would for a 120-page script. And besides taking less to read, it's going to, or less time to read, it's going to take less time to actually shoot. So I would recommend really going through all of your scripts and really going scene by scene, line by line, whether it's dialogue or action lines, and just getting rid of every single thing you don't need. Because a lot of these scripts out there, so who knows? It might be a really long story and maybe it needs to be 120 pages, but I've seen so many scripts that have a bunch of extra scenes for no reason and a bunch of extra dialogue for no reason. Specifically in comedy, which is where I do most of my work, and I'll be like, okay, what is the point of this scene? And I say that to the writer, and they're like, well, it's really funny. And I'd say, yeah, it's really funny, but if you just totally cut that out of the script, the movie is still going to be pretty much exactly the same. So, what I always recommend and what I think all writers should do is for comedies, take all of those jokes and organically fit them into the story. Like, you shouldn't have a scene just because it's funny. So, take those jokes and organically write them into other scenes that actually are important to the story and are pivotal. So that way, you don't necessarily have a scene just because it's funny, because those are the scenes that are going to potentially get cut on the editing room floor and just left in the cutting room. So if you can cut them from the script, it's going to make one, it's going to make everyone's job a lot easier. It's going to save the production money. It's going to save the production resources. It's going to make it so you don't necessarily need to even shoot it. So the shorter your script can be, the better. You obviously don't want it to be like 70 pages or something where it could be considered like a short. But I always say as close to 100 pages as possible. If you can get it under 100 pages, great. 90 to 100 pages, especially for comedy, I think is a sweet spot. If it's under 110 pages, like it's not the end of the world. But anything over 110, I think you always have room to be able to cut it shorter. Because unless you're like a Steven Spielberg or some huge name screenwriter, a lot of producers are not going to want to read a script that is that long just because people are busy and people are lazy and don't really feel like reading nowadays.
yeah. And there is also just the logistics of like this is something I complain about in movies where I'm like, really? That movie's 2 hours long? Why is that movie 2 hours long? That movie doesn't need to be 2 hours long. Can we do an hour and a half, please? I wanna get home from the theater. Um, which seems silly to complain about because like I love movies and I love TV and I love watching it. But every once in a while, something that's like two, 2.5, Lord forbid 3, I'm like, that's like an entire afternoon. That's like
I
my
know.
whole day.
I would say the exact same thing. People have really short attention spans now. One example, so last night I actually saw the new live action How to Train Your Dragon movie, which I really
Oh,
enjoyed. I did really enjoy that. It was good. The movie is 2 hours and 5 minutes, and the original was an hour and 38 minutes. So it's like almost a half hour longer. I get some of it probably as credits. Um, but thinking like, how is there like 20? The movie was so similar to the original. I'm like, how is there like 27 extra
yeah.
minutes? Some of it might just be extra end credits because they definitely needed a lot more crew members, I would say, to make the live action movie. But at the same time, like people like shorter movies. Like no
Yeah.
one wants to really sit down and watch. And I don't want to say no one because people do love. There is always going to be an audience for it, but a lot of times, say you're relaxing one night and you want to throw on a short 90-minute movie that you don't have to think much about. Like not that many people have the time or attention span now to throw on a 3-hour movie.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So everybody, as short or as long as it needs to be, but no longer. Not just longer for fun. All right, cool. Well, it looks like we have answered everybody's questions, and they are all excited and ready to, have a as solid a pre-production experience so that they can have a great production experience and they can have a great post-production experience. Everybody's ready to go make their movies.
Yeah, that's what I would hope. And if everybody enjoyed this, like I'd love for you to reach out. One, you could to me personally, but also to Roadmap because I definitely enjoy doing these. We did another one a few months back that was just an overall like how to make a movie from script to distribution, and we touched on everything a little bit. And then for this one, we thought it would be fun to focus on pre-production. And I'd love to do an actual production one and even post and a after post when you actually have a finished movie. So if you enjoyed this, definitely reach out and tell Roadmap and myself that you want more, and hopefully we can get one set up.
Yeah, we'll do like a whole series, like how to make a movie the series.
Yeah. And then who knows,
Right.
maybe some people could sign up for those and they actually can go make their movies and they can do their own series.
Yeah.
Is that
Oh
how they
my
made
gosh, I
theirs?
love it. Paying it forward, just keeping the thing going. Well, all right, cool. So I'll set everybody free. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Brandon, for taking the time on a Father's Day. Thank you, everyone, for attending on Father's Day. And then those of you who could not make it because it is Father's Day, hello from the past. I hope you have a great time whenever you watch this. And we will see you all on the next one. But be well, everybody.
Yep. Thanks so much for joining, everybody.